The rain tapped lightly against the window as 12-year-old Liam sat by the sill, watching the world outside his small suburban neighborhood. He had always been curious about the house across the street, the one with the overgrown garden and faded blue shutters. It had an eerie kind of beauty, a quiet presence that made it stand out from the neat, well-kept homes around it. But what fascinated Liam the most was the woman who lived there, Mrs. Henderson. She was old, very old. Her silver hair was always tied up in a neat bun, and she moved slowly, her frail frame wrapped in oversized cardigans, no matter the season. Most kids in the neighborhood whispered about her, making up wild stories about her past. Some said she was a witch. Others claimed she had once been a famous actress who disappeared from the world. But no one really knew her. No one tried to. Except for Liam. It started one summer afternoon when Liam was kicking a soccer ball outside and accidentally sent it flying over her fence. He hesitated before approaching, heart pounding in his chest. Everyone told him to stay away, but curiosity won over fear. When he knocked on her door, expecting a grumpy old lady to scold him, he was instead met with the warmest smile he had ever seen. "Well, well," Mrs. Henderson chuckled, peering at him over her round glasses. "Looks like I've got myself a visitor." From that day on, an unlikely friendship blossomed. Liam began visiting her regularly, drawn in by her stories, tales of a past so rich and colorful that it felt like stepping into another world. She told him about growing up in a time when things were simpler, yet harder, about traveling to places he had only seen in books, and about the love she had lost along the way. Her home was filled with old photographs, paintings, and little trinkets from different parts of the world, each with a story of its own. As weeks turned into months, Mrs. Henderson became more than just a neighbor to Liam. She became a friend, a mentor, a source of warmth in a world that sometimes felt too fast and too cold. His parents found it strange at first, but when they saw how much he enjoyed their time together, they let it be. But seasons changed, and so did life. One winter evening, Liam noticed that Mrs. Henderson's house was unusually quiet. The lights, that usually flickered warmly through the windows, remained dark. His stomach tightened as he walked up to her door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. The next morning, he woke up to the sight of an ambulance parked outside her house. His heart sank. Mrs. Henderson had passed away in her sleep. Liam felt a strange emptiness settle inside him, like a piece of his world had suddenly disappeared. He wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. He just stood there, staring at the house, feeling a kind of loneliness he had never known before. Days passed, then weeks. Life moved on, but a part of him stayed stuck in that moment, until one evening, when a knock on his door changed everything. A man in a suit stood outside, holding an envelope with Liam's name on it. His parents looked confused as they took it, but when they opened it, their expressions shifted from confusion to pure shock. Mrs. Henderson had left something for Liam, and it wasn't just a simple letter. Liam held his breath as he read the words. Inside, his hands trembling, what he discovered that night would change everything he thought he knew about his old friend. Because Mrs. Henderson wasn't just a lonely old woman, she was a millionaire, and she had left behind a secret that no one, especially Liam, could have ever imagined. Liam sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the letter in his hands. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just read. Mrs. Henderson, a millionaire. It didn't seem possible. She had always lived so modestly, in that old house with creaky floors and a front yard that had long been overtaken by wildflowers. There were no fancy cars, no expensive jewelry, nothing that would have ever hinted at a fortune. And yet, here it was, written in neat, careful handwriting. The letter was short, but every word carried weight. Mrs. Henderson had left something behind for him. The details weren't clear, only that her lawyer would explain everything. His parents exchanged uneasy glances, but Liam could see they were just as curious as he was. A few days later, they arrived at a quiet office downtown, where an older man in a sharp suit greeted them. His name was Mr. Whitaker, and he had been Mrs. Henderson's lawyer for many years. He motioned for them to sit before pulling out a thick folder from his desk. "Liam," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Mrs. Henderson cared for you deeply. You were a great comfort to her in her final years. And because of that, she wanted you to have something very special." Liam swallowed hard, gripping the arms of his chair. His heart pounded as Mr. Whitaker opened the folder and pushed forward a stack of documents. "She left you everything." The words hit like a shockwave. His parents gasped, his mother covering her mouth with her hand. Liam just sat there, frozen. Everything. The house, the land, the money. Mrs. Henderson had left it all to him. It didn't feel real. He expected someone to jump out and say it was a mistake. But Mr. Whitaker only continued, explaining how Mrs. Henderson had been wealthier than anyone had realized. She had inherited a fortune from her late husband, a successful investor, but had chosen to live a simple life. She had never been interested in status or luxury. She had found joy in books, art, and the stories she shared with Liam. But why him? Out of all the people she could have left her wealth to, why had she chosen a 12-year-old boy? That question haunted Liam as the days passed. The news spread quickly, and soon, people who had never even glanced at Mrs. Henderson were suddenly talking about her. Old neighbors who had once ignored her started sharing stories, pretending they had been close. Strangers began showing up near her house, curious about the mystery fortune. It made Liam uncomfortable. And then, the letters started arriving, not from Mrs. Henderson this time, but from people claiming to be long-lost relatives, cousins, nieces, nephews, people who had never been around before, suddenly wanted a piece of her wealth. They wrote to the lawyer, demanding explanations, some even threatening legal action. Liam's parents were overwhelmed, unsure of what to do. They considered walking away from it all, but Liam felt something deep inside him telling him not to. This wasn't just about money. It was about Mrs. Henderson, about her life, her choices, her story. Determined to understand more, he started going through her belongings. He spent hours in her house, sifting through old letters, journals, and dusty photo albums. He found pictures of her as a young woman, standing beside a man with kind eyes, her husband, Henry. Letters between them spoke of a love so deep and beautiful that Liam felt tears prick his eyes. But then he found something else, a hidden compartment, in the back of a bookshelf. Inside, there was a small wooden box, locked with a tiny key. It took him hours to find the key, tucked away in an old jewelry box. When he finally opened the wooden box, his breath caught in his throat. Inside were bank documents, proving just how much money Mrs. Henderson had, more than he had imagined. But that wasn't what shocked him the most. There were also letters addressed to people he had never heard of, letters that had never been sent. One, in particular, stood out. It was addressed to a name he didn't recognize. But as he read, his hands began to shake. The letter revealed a secret. Mrs. Henderson had a child, a son, and he had disappeared decades ago. Liam's heart pounded as he scanned the pages, piecing together the truth. Mrs. Henderson had spent years searching for him, trying to find any trace of his whereabouts. But somewhere along the way, She had given up hope. She had never spoken of it, never let on that she had carried this pain with her all these years. Why had no one known? What had happened to her son? And most importantly, was he still out there? The questions swirled in Liam's mind, heavy and relentless. And if he was out there, did he even know what he had lost? Liam sat on the dusty floor of Mrs. Henderson's living room, the letter trembling in his hands. His mind raced with questions. Mrs. Henderson had a son, a child she had spent her life searching for. But where was he now? Did he even know? She was gone. Did he know how much she had loved him? The weight of the discovery pressed on his chest. He couldn't let this be another lost secret, buried in the past. He had to find out the truth. With his parents' help, Liam took the letter to Mr. Whitaker, who listened carefully as Liam explained everything he had found. The lawyer's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like recognition. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I knew about her son," Mr. Whitaker admitted. "She confided in me years ago, but she never wanted to talk about it much. It was painful for her. She always hoped he would come back." Liam felt a lump in his throat. "Do you know what happened to him?" Mr. Whitaker nodded slowly. "She told me he ran away when he was young. They had an argument about money, about the future. She wanted to protect him, but he wanted freedom, and then he just disappeared. She tried to find him for years, but the trail went cold." Liam's heart sank. He could see it so clearly now. The sadness in Mrs. Henderson's eyes whenever she talked about the past, the way she never spoke about family. She had been waiting for a son who never returned. But then Mr. Whitaker pulled out another folder. "I did some searching after she passed," he said. "She never stopped hoping, even near the end. She asked me to look for him again, just in case." He hesitated, then pushed the folder toward Liam. "And I found something." Liam's fingers shook as he opened it. Inside was a single document, a name, an address. Mrs. Henderson's son was alive. Liam's pulse pounded in his ears as he read. He lived in a nearby city, not too far away, but there was no way to know if he even remembered his mother, or if he would care that she was gone. His parents were cautious, telling him not to get his hopes up, but Liam knew what he had to do. A week later, they stood outside a small, quiet apartment building. Liam's heart raced as he knocked on the door. There was a long pause, then slow footsteps. The door creaked open, and a man stood there. A man with tired eyes and streaks of grey in his dark hair. He looked at Liam, then at Liam's parents, confusion clear on his face. "Can I help you?" His voice was rough, hesitant. Liam swallowed hard. "Are you James Henderson?" The man stiffened. His face paled. He looked like he might slam the door, but something in Liam's expression stopped him. "Why are you asking?" Liam took a deep breath and held out the letter. "Because your mother was looking for you." James hesitated, then took the paper, his hands unsteady. As his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught. He staggered back slightly, gripping the doorframe. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying again. "She's gone?" Liam nodded. "She never stopped waiting for you." For a long moment, James said nothing. His eyes flickered over the words his mother had written, the pain on his face unmistakable. Then, to Liam's surprise, he let out a shaky breath and whispered, "I thought she hated me." Liam felt a lump in his throat. "She never did." Silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words. Then, finally, James stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. That night, Liam sat across from him, listening as James told his side of the story, how he had been young and reckless, angry at the world, how he had left and convinced himself he was doing the right thing, and how over time it became harder and harder to go back, until he convinced himself he wasn't wanted anymore. But now, holding the letter in his hands, he knew the truth. A few days later, James stood outside the house he had once called home. His eyes swept over the familiar windows, the peeling blue shutters. He stepped inside slowly, taking in the scent of old books and faded memories. He ran his fingers over the framed photographs, the ones his mother had never taken down, and then he found the box Liam had discovered. With shaking hands, he opened it and pulled out the letters his mother had written, but never sent. Tears welled in his eyes as he read her words, her endless love, her hope that one day he would come back. Liam watched as James wiped at his eyes and let out a heavy breath. "I never thought I'd get a second chance." "You do," Liam said, softly. "She wanted you to." In the end, James didn't care about the money. He didn't fight for an inheritance. All he wanted was to know that he hadn't been forgotten, that his mother had never stopped loving him. And because of Liam, he finally knew the truth. A few weeks later, Liam sat on Mrs. Henderson's porch, looking out at the garden that had once been wild and overgrown. Now it was neatly trimmed, the flowers blooming again under the care of someone who had returned home. James had chosen to stay, to take care of the house, to keep the memories alive. Liam smiled to himself. Mrs. Henderson had given him more than just a house, more than just a story. She had given him a purpose. She had shown him that sometimes, even the smallest kindness could change a life, and in the end, she had found her way back to the person she had missed the most. Even if it was too late for words, it was never too late for love.